I am going to introduce your presenters for this presentation of overview of Chaplains and Chaplain's Aide. We have John Lyon. John is an Eagle Scout who presently serves on the Awards, Emblems, and Literature Subcommittee of the National Religious Relationships Committee. He is also a chartered organization representative, the Atlanta Area Council Religious Relationships Chair, the Council's Religious Emblems Coordinator, and the Area 9 Venturing Associate Advisor. John has been a chaplain for the 2013 National Jamboree, the 2017 National Jamboree, and the 2019 World Jamboree. And the best ideas to encourage duty to God come from Chaplains and Chaplain's Aide. We also have Will J. Road joining us today. Will serves as chaplain for Troop 3752 in Canton, Georgia. He is a member of the Atlanta Area Council Religious Relationships Committee and has completed an interfaith service guide available online as part of his Wood Badge ticket. Will earned his Eagle Scout in 1991 at Troop 345 in Clinton, Mississippi. All right, welcome. Thank you all for joining us for the Chaplain's Aide training. And I will let you guys take it away.
Thank you very much, Susan. I appreciate that. And thankfully, all of us are here for one purpose, and that's to learn a little bit more about Chaplains and Chaplain's Aide training. If you've been around in scouting for a while, you might know that there are a few changes that have happened along the way, not just to scouting, but also to Chaplains, Chaplain's Aide. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking through that, and hopefully you'll come away with some inspiration, because honestly, and I know I'm jumping ahead of my slides, this is one of the more important pairings of team in a troop or a crew, or shall we even go so far as to say a ship. Well, let's spend some time talking about that. You've already seen or heard rather about our descriptions. Here's what Will and I both look like, and I would say glance at the bottom one because I'm just me. With that said, let's cover quickly some nonverbals. Number one is, if you choose to look at the participants, you have a number of options there, and I just bring that up so that you can see it. And then we'll say, if you want to use the raise hand feature of that participant's little toolbar, then you can do that to speak, or you can use the chat feature. And trust me, Will help me keep online and make sure we get all the questions taken care of. Duty to God is honestly the cornerstone of scouting. It's very obvious. It is part of what we say every time we repeat the Scout oath and law. From that, beyond just being foundational, there's so many ways that we can emphasize duty to God. But I would encourage you to take a look at Chaplain and Chaplain's Aide, because if these two positions are active in your unit, I think it becomes a tremendous advantage in incorporating duty to God that meets the needs of all of the participants in the unit. So we have the position patches of Chaplain, Chaplain Aide, and then you see a blue one. Hold on, I'll talk through this a bit. We have, for Scouts BSA, we have a Chaplain's Aide position, and that is the one that you see in the middle, a nice khaki. The blue one is for Sea Scouts. And those of you who are familiar with it, you recognize the standard Sea Scout logo. But what's missing from this, and Amanda and I have talked about it a little bit earlier today, is that there's not a green one for venturing, or a red background with green venturing. And that may be an issue more with BSA Supply and whether or not they can stock those, since they're not being apparently used a lot, but I do know of a lot of venturing Chaplain's Aides. So anyway, that's my commentary. You'll see these patches available through scoutstuff.org and your local scout shop. Let's take a look at the original training, the hard copy manual that I came into scouting with. And by the way, I should make one quick reference. When I became an adult leader in scouting, I had different hair color. So with that said, I may go back a little bit further than some. And I had copies of this manual for Chaplains and Chaplain's Aide for a long time. Now, I'm not going to read these slides to you. I want you to begin to get the idea that there are a lot of specific things said about both positions. This is a very detailed listing of what's important for these positions, and I want to concentrate briefly on the troop chaplain. You'll see a lot of discussion about how they need to have a troop chaplain, and this is the way the wording was. So just understand that I'm leaving it in that context right now of a troop. And they wanted to have a very specific person, and you can read through all of those descriptions, and it gives you an idea that there should be a very detailed selection process to be able to find someone who can truly do the job. And then there's the chaplain aide. And I've modified this just a little bit because originally it said Boy Scouts, and now we say Scouts BSA troops, venturing crews, and Sea Scout ships. And you see how those are, I would call them upper level descriptions of what goes on. These two documents are about 2.5, 3 pages apiece. And the reason that I focus you on this is you need to have a basis to know where this started and what we've come into now. By the way, you might be wondering, why does John have OOD up at the top? It simply stands for out of date. Where we are today is a much more exciting place as far as our training. Now, what you have here, since this is an online training module, I can't very easily go through and get screen captures and try to do the entire module justice. So what I would interest you in doing is going to Scouting U and taking the course yourself. And you can see that in the little brief description, it's serving as a chaplain or chaplain's aide provides the opportunity to help scouts. Well, that's what we're in the business for, right? We want to help, and they will grow both physically and spiritually. So my reason in pointing this out is you're actually looking at a certificate of what happens once you've completed the course. We'll talk a little bit about what that course actually looks like, because it is a very novel concept and it's interactive to a point where you won't lose track of where things are. This online module, as you can see, was under development for a number of years. And Susan Lawyer is the current training subcommittee chair for the National Religious Relationships Committee. Her predecessor just finished this up along with about 7 or 8 other folks in working together in putting this module, all of it, in a format that could be worked with online. As you can see from the bullet item, the storyboarding took 3/4 of the development time, and if you've ever produced anything in a video format, you understand. I'm reminded of the video rule that I was given many, many years ago, and that is if you've got 5 minutes worth of video to broadcast, you shoot 5 hours worth. So perhaps that gives you a little insight into why it took so long to get everything together, and then it was released. And this is probably the key thing I want you to realize about the online training. It was to establish both separate and shared responsibilities for the adult and youth position. It was issued together. You learn about both of them, and that's why I think it is an absolute key to look at this module and make sure that you absorb it. It doesn't hurt to go back and take it again. If you caught it from when I showed you the printout, that was actually my first taking of the course. I try to do it frequently just so I can keep everything in mind. And I took it right after the module was released in April of 2017. It takes about 2 hours to go through. And I want to underscore that this is basic training. This is where you can give majority of the information, and then we're able to at least give both the chaplain and chaplain's aide an opportunity to understand the basics of it and objectives as to how they're supposed to go about their positions. Now, and again, I'm trying to make sure I get there's my next slide. But wait, there's more. You thought this might be a short training session. Well, we're going to delve into another aspect of it, which keys on the last line of the previous slide, which was basic training. There was an advanced training module that was put together, and of this advanced training, it was a very significant document that was put together. I've given you the references there so that you can see them. This came out in 2018. It was actually fairly late in 2018 when this first appeared. Several of us have it in PDF format. You can also find it in a couple of places that you might find on scouting.org. And it is not exactly what you would call a light course. So let's go through a couple of these things. I'm going to show you the outline as they developed it. And the first of all is your review of online training. To many of you, this sounds pretty basic because as we do any advanced courses, there's always a review of what we previously had learned. Then you see the module for interfaith considerations. There's an entire section on how to do prayers. And I'm encouraging you to take a look at this document because I think it's very instructive. It can be used as a bit of a resource, even if a chaplain's aide has not been able to go through the full training. You can take advantage of many of the resources that are included. Notice that that looks like a fairly short day on day one, and you might have an idea where this is going, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You have day two with an opening story, and then in any advanced training that we do in scouting, there is a team building component to it. And we all know the various words that go with team building, so I won't delve into those. I'll just remind you to think about that. And this is applied to this module as well. Then we have scout studies. The seventh one is worship, and that takes on a lot of different flavors. We'll not go into that, but I would encourage you again to look at the document and take a close look at how it all comes together as far as worship in a standardized class. There's a discussion about Scout Anniversary Week, which of course is going to include Scout Sunday, Scout Sabbath, and Scout Jama. By the way, interesting footnote, just a side note, doesn't cost extra. Scout Sunday, Scout Jama, Scout Sabbath can be up to the individual congregations as to when that actually occurs. So even though it's traditionally during that first week of February, it changes depending on what the congregation would like to do. Now, to the next day, we're still crunching along in day two, and we have lunch with a charter organization representative. Now, some might wonder why this would even be a part of it, because charter organization representatives are an interesting bunch. When you look at them collectively, they have either high levels of scouting experience, or perhaps they were part of that particular group that said, okay, we need somebody to fill this position. You're the liaison between the unit and the organization. So you've got a wide variety of folks who have different notions as to what their position is. Hopefully they've had basic training, and that's pretty much what's presented in this. And they have some charter organization representatives come in and spend some time during lunch to chat, to sit at the table, to have those kinds of side conversations. Immediately after lunch is done, then you start on the service project. And then an important component that we see in NYLT and some others courses for youth, guiding a conversation. And I think that's an excellent technique that all of us probably are sharpening every single day. Then you have Module 11, Training the Chaplain's Aides. Now, it might seem that that's a fairly short afternoon for day two. I would caution you not to think that. We'll explain in a moment. Day three, you have a worship service. Module 13 is a debrief. Then you have a session on religious emblems, and then graduation. I said all of that to say that, as you can probably figure out, this is not a short course. This is focused on being a full 2.5 days, and presumably you would do this on the weekend. Now, when you start to do this kind of commitment, this requires both a youth and an adult to be able to free up that entire time to be able to do it. And some of those modules, now I just showed you the outline, but let me show you a little bit of the description of the training of the chaplain aide, module number 11. When you look at the content time, let's see if my math is correct, that gets pretty close to 6 hours. Well, perhaps 5.5. And then you have a process which, if you are familiar with Scouting's EDGE method, we explain, demonstrate, guide, and enable. So here we see you training a chaplain aide, they develop a Vesper service, they'll have dinner, and then they practice a worship service. Now they've had a module previously on worship, so they're beginning to get all of these pieces together. And then at the close of the day on what is usually Saturday, or at least day 2, you have a Vesper service. Now, I don't know if you caught it, but just a little bit earlier in that module, they were to develop a Vesper service, and then they're going to actually have it. They will practice their worship service ahead of time because, frankly, worship services are a little bit more involved and take a little bit longer, not only to develop, but as others have said in previous sessions today, you need to know who's in the room. You need to know who's in the unit and how best to serve all of those different faith groups represented. And obviously the objective is that with these separate and shared responsibilities, a chaplain and chaplain aide, you'll be able to explain what the collaboration between the two is. Now let me stop for a second and go back to that charter organization representative. Presentation earlier today mentioned the faithful key 3, the faith key 3. And why is that significant? Well, you see, I imagine that chaplain and chaplain's aide would make up 2 of those positions, but the charter organization representative makes up the 3rd. So that's another aspect of why you have these 3 people, even though the charter organization representative may be just involved in the selection of the chaplain and helping to encourage that there is a chaplain's aide and that they get the proper training. This is the kind of thing that I think begins to change the way we look at from the basic training to the advanced training and lend some true importance to these positions, because frequently, especially in the area of chaplain aide, that tends to get selected as, okay, you need a rank position, a service position for the next rank, and so here's what you have, the chaplain's aide is left. And what we're really interested, both for a chaplain and a chaplain's aide, is to find someone who really wants to do it, really cares about it. And that takes time and effort to find those folks, but it's well worth the investment. Yet, besides the 2.5-day option, it seems like a lot of time to involve in trying to do advanced training. A few folks who asked about it were allowed to at least review and compress the course with a potential 4 to 5 hour event. Now that's a little bit more manageable, and I think at a district or perhaps even a council level, this would be far more palatable if they can still cover the basics of the advanced training. I say that, and now I'm going to take a deep breath and point you to the next bullet item, because even though this is ongoing right now, there are challenges to get permission from national to allow a council use of the compressed version. So it takes time. It's almost like thinking about it in terms of molasses. It doesn't move rapidly. But we want to encourage you to think about the advanced training module to help your chaplain and chaplain's aide. Once this occurs, once you have those positions and have them trained with the advanced training, you will be astonished to see what happens in individual units. And nothing pleases me more than to be at an area venturing event and the folks who are acting as the leadership came to me and says, we have an interfaith worship service to do. And I just reached, pulled a plastic bag that has a good half dozen or more resources and said, why don't you look at this? That was the extent of my involvement, because they put together an amazing interfaith service and ran it flawlessly. The reason that I push that so much as a personal experience is that that's where we have what we want. We have the youth being involved and the youth actually doing it in such a way that they know the faith groups in their unit, and they're able to put everything in a context where every scout comes away with something of faith that they feel good about, that they experienced during that event. I'm about ready to fire off into questions, but I will, before we do that, mention quickly that on the slide you see there is my email, also Will's, and we encourage you to, if you don't have questions or if you have that get answered today, we're going to try really hard to do that. But if you have further questions after today, by all means, shoot us an email. We'll be glad to respond to you. With that, Will, what questions do we have at this moment?
So we had a question about chaplain qualifications and questions about whether you can have more than one. And so I said, yeah, absolutely. There's no limitation on the number of chaplains or chaplains aides. It'd be awesome to have that. But as John said, it's usually difficult to get, it's difficult to even get a chaplain's aide. I've even had trouble in my troop getting chaplain's aide to step up. The documentation of the requirements say that ideally the scout is first class and above. They've either obtained their religious emblem award or they're working on it, and they're looked at by the troop as a scout that the other scouts trust with spiritual things. So that's a lot to ask from a 13, 14-year-old kid, but you do get that. So the idea of specific requirements, ideally the chaplain is a member of the clergy or a layperson that serves in the church of the charter ward. For Catholic, I know there's additional requirements that are more strict, and there's a Catholic session coming up later. In my own personal experience, I joined the troop when my son crossed over and didn't have a chaplain, and I went to the scoutmaster after about a year, and I was like, hey, I'd be willing to volunteer as a chaplain. He's like, okay, do you believe in God? I'm like, yep. And he says, you're hired. So technically the chaplain reports to the committee chair. So that's another interesting thing. The chaplain is not an ASM. They're a member of the committee, and they report to the committee chair. And like John was saying, like really the chaplain needs to be in sync with especially if it's a religious charter ward, they need to be in sync with the leader of that organization as well as the charter ward rep.
One of the things that I'll just share, and those of you may find this will happen also to you if you're in a certain circumstance, is that when I was asked to become the charter organization representative of the units at my home church, when I accepted that, I started looking a little bit, and I said, okay, let me meet with the units. And then I said, okay, where's your chaplain? And I got crickets. And my institutional head is a great friend. And so I told him, I said, we're kind of in an interesting spot looking for a chaplain. And he looked me dead in the eye and says, you're a deacon, right? Yes, you're the chaplain. Okay, so you have a wide variety of opportunities as to what to do, but I would echo something that I heard from Will's personal, and that simply is, if you have someone who is desirous to do it, then I think sometimes you look away from some of the specific requirements and say, do I have a scout that really wants to do this? And if the answer is yes, then I think you take a different look at it and you say, let's try to get them involved. Okay. Other questions?
So, yeah, I said like the chaplain isn't an ASM, but there's absolutely no reason you couldn't have multiple roles. You could be an ASM, a chaplain, and a committee member. You could possibly be the charter ward rep and the chaplain. That's a lot of work.
Yes.
So, and it's going to be different. So, like scouting, there's a lot of diversity in what a chaplain is and how they get onboarded and then how they perform it. For troops that are chartered by non-religious organizations, it could be any individual in your community that's in the troop that is spiritually mature and is looked at as a spiritual mentor by the troop. For troops that are chartered by specific religious organizations, obviously you want somebody that reflects that org. However, we have churches here in the Atlanta area that are Methodist churches, and they have they host several troops that are primarily Hindu. So it's an interesting scenario. Obviously, you wouldn't want a Methodist chaplain for your Hindu troop, but you know, it depends on the person's experience. Yeah.
One of the things
Question?
that
Got a hand raised.
Yep.
Okay, go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Paula. I'm from Rochester, New York, and so I've been a district chaplain actually before I became a unit chaplain, because I became a district chaplain when my son was still in Cubs, and so I've served as a district chaplain for 5 years and a unit chaplain for the last few. I am now also a scoutmaster. We have this running joke is I have a collection. I wear hats all the time. I have a collection of hats from various scout things, and sometimes I switch hats while I'm giving announcements to give the idea that I'm actually switching roles when I do that. What I found is we have a very small troop with a lot of diversity, particularly neurodiversity. So sometimes our older scouts are not ready for a role like a chaplain aide, and sometimes our younger scouts are. So our last chaplain aide, it was a tenderfoot, and he wasn't necessarily the most mature person, but what we have chosen in our troop is, particularly with our scouts like this, to take a much more hands-on method of guiding rather than let's just see what they do. So there's a whole technique for that. And when I became scoutmaster a couple of weeks ago, they asked me to stay on as chaplain because I had been working with the chaplain aides to, okay, let's think through this. Our charter org charters 4 units, 2 troops, 2 packs.
Mm-hmm.
They've basically decided to do fairly hands-off. We have a charter org rep who now actually comes to things, which is great, but the clergy and the deacons and whatnot have all done hands-off. We can't even advertise that we're there. So it's sort of like we provide you space and, and do that renewal thing. And otherwise, you guys are kind of on your own. So out of the units that we have, some have chaplains, some don't. And it's kind of this really interesting mix of things. So we're actually a fairly unusual unit in that we always have for the last several years anyway, a chaplain and a chaplain's aide. So we've been trying to export some of this idea through the stuff I do at district. And hearing some of the different ways that people are handling things is helpful. But it's also, we found particularly chaplain aides, we needed to get a lot more hands-on. They many times did not have the religious emblems. They just like doing prayers and things. So we kind of worked with what we had and figured the process of being a chaplain's aide sometimes aids in their own spiritual growth.
So the part of this is, something's better than nothing. If you don't have a chaplain's aide and there's a kid willing to step up and do it, and they're a tenderfoot, by all means, let them be a chaplain. That's the position that my troop has been in most of the time. We were struggling to find a chaplain's aide this time around, even though I'm very active in the Atlanta area in the Religious Relations Committee and other things. Like, it's hard for even me to find somebody in my own troop. The one thing is, so John, I don't know, we didn't get into this, but the idea is that you as a chaplain should be similar to the way that a military chaplain functions. That chaplain should be able to minister to anyone of any faith, of any degree of faith. So unless your charter org is specifically flavored to a certain religion or a certain faith, which you can do as a chartered organization, if it's an interfaith group, which goes beyond the word interdenominational. Right. Interfaith means that you have scouts of multiple faiths and of multiple degrees of faith understanding within your troop. So the chaplain in that situation, you cannot proselytize. You're not there to convert them to your religion. You're there to minister to them and their family's faith as much as possible. That's, I know growing up in Scouts, that was not the case. If you were in a Baptist troop, everything was Baptist. So that's something that I really like about it. It allows me to keep things general and to meet the Scouts where they are, and be kind of that spiritual mentor. There's also an interesting phrase I've run across. If you look at the Scoutmaster as a role model, the chaplain would be the spiritual mentor. So it's kind of an interesting inflection on that role. Like, I, as a chaplain, I tend to want to stand back while the Scouts are running their show, right? So for me, the special time on campouts and summer camp and stuff is at the end of the day when the kids are sitting around the campfire and most of them have gone to sleep, and there's that one kid that wants to talk to you about, is there really a God? Or why are there so many different religions? Or, those big questions that when you start to get into high school, you simply don't have enough life experience to know how to answer those with any kind of strong faith or conviction, but you're old enough to realize like the world's a lot more complicated than I thought. So for me, that's how I play the role. Obviously, there's chaplains that are more like youth ministers. They're very involved, from kind of let's play games and sing songs and that kind of stuff. So it just depends on what you have in your troop.
I see one question that asks, clarify the minister to does not mean that every religious need. It means you will do your best to help them fulfill their religious duties as much as possible. Let me give you a different aspect on that, because what I am most interested in right now, and I think once I mention this, all of you are going to nod your heads in agreement, is that during this time with our quarantines, with our changing dynamics for scouting, we should be very, very, very interested in what our scouts are thinking and be very keen to listen to what their needs are. It is much different than we've ever anticipated. And one of the things that many areas are running into is that when you have a Zoom meeting for active scouts, if you don't have a fairly dynamic program, you've lost them in about the first 5 minutes. Yet the stressors of them, in many cases, especially in my home state, where school essentially ended about the middle of March and everything else was online learning, the dynamics of that are very challenging, even to our scouts. And as you work with the units, you will see this fraying around the edges, I like to think of. And I would encourage you to take a look out for things that can assist. For chaplains, one of the first things I think of is what tools do I need? When I was working as Jamboree chaplain, one of our key leaders came up with something, showed me a psychological first aid app to put on my phone. I thought that was marvelous. When I saw other things that could carry over, such as right now there's a Red Cross first aid, mental health or psychological first aid. It kind of goes under two monikers. Those classes are focused specifically on helping our youth through COVID-19. And one of the things that I'm very amused at is it talks about, you know, you can use this for your kids, you can use it for your grandkids. And I look at it as I can use it for scouting. And I think these are the kind of things where when we're trying to meet the needs of our scouts, and as I used to say when I was teaching a course that no one's going to remember this title from years ago, but in speaking to scoutmasters and assistant scoutmasters, I would tell them straight up, be ready, because when you're on a camp out, you may hear things that you've never expected. They will tell you things that they don't tell their parents. And these kinds of situations is when you care, where you listen, and you try to help in any way that you can. If you're equipped and you have some of these resources, then you can make a difference. And you can even help your chaplain's aide, because if the chaplain aide catches on that you really care, then they're going to care too. And peer-to-peer is one of the greatest opportunities to find out how scouts are doing. And if a chaplain's aide really finds something that's concerning, they'll bring it to you. And I think that's where, when we look at where we are at the moment, a caring approach is key for the chaplain and the chaplain's aide.
So there's a couple of real quick things I wanted to mention. So yeah, when I say minister to, what I mean is kind of pastoral care light. We've all had training as adults where, you know, if there's an actually a serious issue where the scout is expressing suicidal thoughts, things like that, you turn them over to a professional, right? So part of being a chaplain is knowing where that boundary is of, hey, this is, you know, these are just like growing up regular life problems that everybody experiences, or hey, this kid actually needs some help. Let me refer him to a professional. So what else was I going to say? That was it. There was a hand raised from Bob. Yeah.
I gotta say something. I gotta say something. So when you say refer for professional help, I cannot implore all of our scouters enough. This is not making a phone call and turning somebody over to a healthcare professional. This is hand carrying a gentle soul to a healthcare provider for the help that they need. In this time, I have never seen the wheels fall off of lives, young lives, so quickly with reports of eating disorders, mental disorders, just self-mutilation. I mean, these are our kids that are forced to deal with serious, serious issues. We are all, as scouters, in one form or another, we are ministers to provide the help that our kids need, our scouts need. So it's not just a quick phone call. It is a genuine, sincere, no kidding, sometimes hand-holding required, giving them the care that they need.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very key, and coming from your wisdom of words coming from across the pond is greatly appreciated. We just touched briefly on mental health first aid. That's an intensive 8-hour course. One of the things that you're trained on how to respond to is if you have substance abuse problems and those kinds of things. And as you mentioned, self-harm comes into it. And one of the trigger points that happens is that when you realize that you have a very, very, very critical situation, you need to treat it just like we do with CPR. When the heart stops and we start CPR, when do you leave? When do you stop doing CPR? You stop when you are relieved. And in this case, you're hand carrying these people directly to whatever resources available to you. You know, if you're at summer camp, I would encourage you to find out ahead of time where the camp, what the camp does as far as getting them some professional help. And I'm not just mentioning about, well, we're going to call on the chaplain or a commissioner who's at summer camp. That's not what I mean. Any of this training points you to, as Will put it, know what your limits are. And I know what mine are, and mine are just basic first aid. I recognize the situation, and then I'm going to take the requisite action. And in many cases, that means whatever else I was going to do just got punched on hold, because we need to take care of the scout. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Here we got a bunch of hands. Bob, let's go with you first, and then we'll go to Elizabeth.
We keep talking about the chaplain and the chaplain days as individuals. I had an experience at a summer camp where my unit was put with an inner city unit, of which I don't think any of the youth had dads at home. And I watched the adults that were part of that group basically serve as the chaplains and cared for those youth. They were up all night long talking to one scout after another, each of them, to fill in the role of father to those scouts. And I'd never really thought about the need for that, but I think it's very important for you to look at your dynamics of your group and figure out, maybe it's not a chaplain, maybe it's a chaplain and the rest of their team to help support that group of scouts. That allows you to do that handoff, and it may be just care and feeding along the way, as Jerry brought up.
Yeah, and so I know personally in the situations I've been in, the other ASMs, the other parents, they're all part of the larger conversation, especially with scouts that are really seeking spiritual things. So, yeah, I mean, it takes the entire team, but that is a good point. Yeah, Elizabeth, or did we answer your statement, Bob? Yeah, okay.
So I've been teaching Art Merit Badge virtually for the last couple of months, and running about 7 days a week, a couple hours at a time. But one scout, he had missed the last session. So we had a 3-hour Zoom to get him all caught up and finished. But during that process, I just have some mellow music in the background, and he's getting his instruction. He's, working on his art therapy basically, and finishing up his project so he can finish his merit badge. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, and his parents in the background, but he opens up about how he's angry about the virus. And I wasn't expecting that, it's our merit badge. And when he says that, I said, well, why are you angry about the virus? I figured he's like, because he's not in school, he's missing his friends. But the greeter at the desk, when the youth come into the school, had contracted the COVID and passed away. And he was very much loved by the entire school and the youth, and they looked at him as like, a grandparent figure as soon as he gets to school every day, and they're checking in and they see him. And so now he's gone, and of course there's no school year, and he was opening up about how he was distressed. And I said, well, you could use your art. He's very gifted. Use your art to, draw a tribute picture to him and see if the school can frame it and put a plaque when you guys come back to school. But he just opened up, and his little tender heart was just broken because his beloved figure that he saw every day is now gone. So you just never know when they're going to touch you in a way where they have to express what they're feeling. And it's not necessarily at a troop meeting or a Scout Sunday or a chapel service. You know, that was just our merit badge, but he needed to unburden his, heart with that.
As we've talked here in the last, especially in the last few minutes, you've seen the expansion of our notion of what chaplains do, probably far more so than you had thought of, and with specific instances that come up, whether it happens in a unit level, whether it happens, unfortunately, as a lightning strike at a jamboree. Chaplains are extremely important, and one of the greatest qualities is being able to listen, being able to just be there. A friend of mine once, in instructing youth, said that, very young youth, said that love equals time. If you want to make a difference, if you want to have your scouts respond to you, then you spend time with them. And I have learned, I don't ask them a lot of questions like, what do you want to do? Because I tend to get the deer in the headlights look. But I do listen, and I try to be sensitive to what's going on and what's around them. What is their environment? One of the things that has been a challenge is that during the time of, during this time of things not working extremely well with learning at home and having those kind of online situations, it's very, very discouraging to hear the number of times that there have been, shall we say, instances of not a good situation to learn in. And I'll leave it at that. You can carry your notions further as to what I'm referring to. But I spend time with some youth protection specialists here in Atlanta, and they're very concerned about how our youth are doing. And I don't know where your situation is, but as we start back in school, whenever that is, in August or September, in many cases, counties do not know yet what their plans are going to be. And I fully understand that and don't throw any rocks at them for that. But what I do want to be realistic about is that level of uncertainty makes a huge difference. And so even as we're doing virtual meetings with our units, an encouragement is very simple. Let's make sure that we are putting the most positive aspects of it forward, because they're going to read every aspect of how we say and what we do. And I think as we go to chaplain's aides, you encourage that chaplain's aide to be just that involved in knowing how the rest of the scouts are doing. So I have seen a few things, but I noticed that one person started and then a couple of others have joined in about the mental health first aid course that I mentioned earlier. And a few of them, one of them in particular, said that it is as vital as CPR training and youth protection training. I would not disagree with that statement, because when we come across situations that we're not ready to deal with, we realize our own inadequacies. And at least with the training, you've got a list of resources where you can start to point to the right direction and get that youth the correct help. Jerry, I see you've got your hand up again. Come on, let's talk.
Yeah, John, my only question is that, I mean, if you looked at the BSA 12 months ago with regard to training and even the prospect of virtual training, the BSA was like, you know what, we have computer-based training, we've got these courses, blah, blah, blah. But now there has been this huge paradigm shift in not only virtual training, but virtual camping and virtual merit badge course offerings. And I mean, everything right now is virtual. And thank goodness that the BSA has the kind of forethought to say, yes, we need to make this shift. where do you see virtual training moving in the future with regard to not just chaplaincy training, but training in general with the BSA? Because surely you have some insight where you're at, and Miss Lawyer and Miss Voigt, about where we're headed with this reality that we're set with being able to. I mean, wouldn't it be great to be able to have this mental health training available to us virtually, to where because I mean I have a lot of experience with dealing with mental health and just some advanced leadership training with my military experience and as a civil servant, but I don't think that we're there. I mean, I think that we are like, we're, you know, you're forced to deal with these situations where you're just like questioning your ability to be prepared to. I mean, honestly, in the last 3 months, I am, and I'm a council assistant commissioner for virtual units. We started a virtual unit program about a year ago, before COVID and all that, with virtual units and Lone Scouts. And within the last 3 months, I've had Scoutmasters come to me saying, you know, I'm dealing with this and this, and I mean, so many issues. I mean, it's just like machine gun fire with the amount of stuff that these kids, I mean, they're kids, they're dealing with this. And I just feel like our Scouters need more accessibility to training. And this having the conversation with John Lyon, you know, John, tell me what to do. I need help with X, you know, and not just sitting behind a computer screen, but this.
I think a key aspect of what you're driving at, and yes, we are doing virtual pretty much everything right now because we kind of have to. We want scouting to continue. But in my case, I look at it and I don't know that my crystal ball is that great, but I'll kind of close it out with this kind of thinking. We have in Atlanta a youth protection seminar where we invite basically all of the youth serving organizations that we have in the state to come to our council office, and the minuscule staff of BSA that is involved with it really just supports the operating committee, which includes, amongst others, GBI. You can keep going with the list. And one of the things on this operating committee that we've been discussing is we don't know if we can hold the event in the way that we have. We had always maxed it out at 300. And my friend Caroline, has been and attended and knows the caliber of it, where we have some amazing speakers that give you the cutting edge. We have DFAX in who speaks to us and those kinds of things. I gave you that background just to say that we're looking at, can we do social distancing and what does that mean? And now we're saying we need to think about doing Zoom. And so the Zoom component, and this is coming in October, so the Zoom component suddenly looms very large. And where I see this potentially for the future, this is strictly my opinion, is when I look at Philmont Training Center, which most of us would quickly agree that Philmont Training Center is the pinnacle of the detailed training that you're going to receive on a particular topic. I can see that we're going to be exploring how we do that, because just like the Methodist Conference and Baptist Conference and a couple of others, the Jewish Conference, were supposed to be happening this week at Philmont, we have melded a number of those classes into this week where we're doing it virtually. And the Methodists actually had shall we say, a smashed together 2-day course on Friday and Saturday to handle much of the topics that they were going to cover out at Philmont. So looking ahead, yes, we're going to have to, number one, have the Zoom meetings. Number two, we're going to have to change the way we think, because many would say youth protection is as much as we need. And I see a bigger picture. I see, as I've talked with youth, I've listened to them, I've seen the dynamics that we're dealing with. We have, in many cases, you have heard through various sources that we have a mental health crisis. I don't know what that term really means to me because I haven't analyzed it, but the people who have said it indicate that our youth are suffering right now, as well as many of the rest of the population. And so when I look at it and try to capture, what do I need to do? What skill sets do I need? One would think that, you know, a good internet search, be careful there. Sometimes you need to understand where things came from. A question that popped up with my references to the mental health first aid course, is that done by BSA? The answer is no. It was developed by some specialists in Australia. It came to the US, and Caroline, I may need your help. I think it was 1984, but I'm not certain. I lost the date of when it came to the US. They have it available in every country.
I believe you're correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think it's key there, and I would ask that if you have any questions about that specifically, you can send them to me, but I'll also ask Caroline to help me out on it a little bit because she's gone through the facilitator training. And so between that, we'll get you as many answers as we possibly can on this. I just encourage you to listen to our scouts, make sure you're aware of what's happening, even in your own area and then a little bit beyond, because we have amazing percentages of what's happening. And I'll just quote one assistant school superintendent who said that during this time last year, from January through at the time this person was speaking, something on the order of April, it had one suicide in that particular county. There have been 8 this year. I say that to give us the incentive to listen to our youth and please, please try to help them in every way that we can. So that's a little bit off topic from what I had started talking about on Chaplains Aide training. Will, thank you again for helping me out with all of this. You can see that I believe in teamwork, so I find good team members and let them do their thing. So thank you all for being here today. Susan, I think we're probably beyond time, so I'm going to flip it back to you and say we can leave now, I think.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank y'all, everybody, for your input and participation, for the conversation, the topics you brought up. They were really good ones. And you know me, I'm pro Chaplain's Aide. It's just foundational for our troop. You know, every troop has to, the 12th point of the Scout Law, it's just part of the program. So I hope you get some willing volunteers. I shared earlier, I've got a Chaplain's Aide that doesn't want to roll off into a different leadership role. He was very disappointed to find out that he had to give up his position as Chaplain's Aide, which totally shocked me, but they're out there and I know they want to do it. So thanks, John. I appreciate it. Thanks, Will. Y'all did a great job.